This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Social Basis of the Female Question by Alexandra Kollontai, newly translated by Elise Hendrick. In this classic text from 1909, Alexandra Kollontai, a leading early figure in the Marxist feminist movement, discusses the history and socioeconomic roots of the struggle for women's equality. Many of the issues that Kollontai touches on in this book remain highly relevant, and her argument that the feminist movement needs to be part of the broader working-class struggle for liberation is as important and powerful today as it was in the early 20th century. Finally available in English, this edition includes an important new foreword by Juliana Gleason and Faiza Yoldasheva. Find The Social Basis of the Female Question at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Every day, millions of Americans get out of bed, tune into the news, and ask themselves a simple question. How the hell did the Republican Party become so spectacularly unhinged? I'm obviously restating the obvious here, but the GOP is fully off the rails, unbothered by any seeming concern for basic political economic stability, the empirical reality of things we can see with our own eyes, the fundamentals of human decency. Trump's remade the Republican Party in his image over the past decade, creating a kind of personalist strongman rule that's without exact precedent in American history. But today's guest, Paul Heideman, argues that the sorry, scary state of today's Republican Party cannot be solely attributed to one strange, horrible man. Rather, it's the product of a range of features of the U.S. political system, some long-standing, others more recent. Heideman argues that the U.S.'s weak party system played a big role in creating the conditions for today's derangement, and the specific forms that derangement has taken. In fact, the big money in politics that took off alongside Newt Gingrich's speakership of the House of Representatives overwhelmed the desires of many GOP leaders, who found themselves facing insurgent far-right candidates, raising huge amounts of money entirely independent of the actual party apparatus. We're stuck in a seemingly never-ending cycle of those far-right insurgents with major fundraising abilities challenging existing party leadership, then winning and becoming the new party leadership, only to then find themselves challenged by even more unhinged insurgents who go on to win and become the new party leaders ad infinitum. A dramatically weakened Republican Party has been unable to organize the U.S. capitalist class. A disorganized U.S. capitalist class has been unable or unwilling to organize as a class for a long time, and so has also been unable to organize the Republican Party. The disorganization of the Republican Party and the disorganization of the U.S. capitalist class have both accelerated the other's spiraling disorganization. And all of that has intensified the accelerating insanity of U.S. politics. Throughout the past decade, major capitalist interests have tried to rein Trump in through boycotts of the GOP after the January 6th insurrection or funding business-aligned Democratic candidates. Those efforts have come to naught. Instead, individual sectors, individual corporations, and spectacularly rich individual billionaires now exercise extraordinary power to get their particular interests and demands met. A weak Republican Party and a disorganized capitalist class mean that the ideological and personal idiosyncrasies of President Trump and of billionaires like Elon Musk, really freakishly bizarre individuals, they matter tremendously in shaping the course of everything. Big business as a collective, as a class, has limited ability to discipline the president and his party. The results, as we see every day, have been chaotic. Paul Heideman is interviewed not by me, but by my guest host and Jacobin editor, Micah Uetricht. Before we get this thing rolling, I'm throwing more dig parties. They're really fun. Next up, Seattle and LA. The dig party in Seattle, Wednesday, May 20th from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. at Stoop Brewing, co-sponsored with How's Our Neighbors. The dig party in LA, May 26th, 6 p.m. onwards at Audiograph Beer Company, and it's co-sponsored with DSA LA and the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, or NDLON. Please RSVP. Links are in the show notes. Also, Berlin. Stay tuned for details on a dig event for June 12th. It's been really fun meeting so many dig listeners at parties in New York and London. We really do have the best listeners, and one of the best things about our best listeners is that you all make the podcast possible through contributions made at patreon.com/thedig. You can listen to everything that we put out without paying us a cent, but thousands of you voluntarily contribute because you understand that those contributions are what make the pod possible. If you can afford to chip in, please do so. We're about to spend a ton of money on a really exciting series with Haymarket on how to think like a Marxist. And it will, I think, be a really valuable political education resource. Plus, we have swag. That's patreon.com/thedig. Click it and contribute. Speaking of invaluable political education resources, we have developed a super comprehensive website to accompany Thara, our giant series on the 20th century history of the Arab East. It's full of study guides, lists of books and articles, videos, really so much. It's an enormous, giant resource. Check it out at tharaproject.com. That's THAWRA project.com. Link in the show notes. Okay, here's Micah Uetricht interviewing Paul Heideman, the author of Rogue Elephant: How Republicans Went from the Party of Business to the Party of Chaos, out now from Verso Books. Heideman holds a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University, Newark, and is a frequent contributor to Jacobin. He works as a history teacher in New York City.
Paul Heideman, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having me on.
You start this book with a comparison between Senator Joseph McCarthy, for whom obviously McCarthyism is named after, and Donald Trump. And your basic point in this comparison is that both of these figures within the Republican Party practiced this kind of unhinged reactionary politics that are in most ways quite far to the right, but are too unhinged, too chaotic for big business, which we typically think of as the core constituency for the Republican Party. But in the case of McCarthy, business elites were able to eventually reel him in. We usually think of the famous line from Attorney Welch during the hearings around the military, communism in the military. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? That is the kind of death knell of McCarthy's anti-communist purges, and that his many overreaches led to an eventual pushback from civil society and from politicians. But you point out that American business elites actually played a key role in bringing McCarthy down and ending his political career. And business elites, despite having similar disdain and even hostility for Trump today, have been able to do no such thing. So one way to think about Trump's presidency is, I guess, what if the guardrails that stopped an unhinged reactionary like Joe McCarthy had fallen and he was able to just do his thing? So talk about that opening comparison between those two figures and why it matters for understanding the Republican Party today.
Yeah, Trump and McCarthy have a lot in common in that they both, as you say, practiced this demagogic mode of far-right politics. And in doing so, they actually both started to threaten some of the core interests of American capital. In McCarthy's case, this really came through two means. First, among the kind of more sophisticated anti-communists and kind of state planners in the United States, there was always a wariness about McCarthy's methods and a sense that he might go too far and really discredit anti-communism. It wasn't that they thought anti-communism was bad, quite the contrary. It's that they thought McCarthy might be bad for anti-communism because he would overreach so far. And this became much, much more intense when McCarthy started going after the army. Because after all, this is the early 1950s. This is the period when the great post-war American empire is really getting built in the aftermath of World War II, at the start of the Korean War, etc. And so to be attacking the army at this time and to be kind of plunging it into bureaucratic chaos in a lot of ways as a result of these attacks was really a move that went much too far for much of the American corporate elite. And they really organized against him in response. That Welch line, of course, made for great drama, but much of the real action was happening behind the scenes in groups like the Committee for Economic Development and the Business Council, which were essentially these organizations of American CEOs that went into action against McCarthy and started organizing other business leaders to move against him, pressuring the White House to really disavow McCarthy. Eisenhower and McCarthy had never been close, but they pushed for a much more active stand from the White House against McCarthy's actions, and organizing the censure motion against him in the Senate, which would ultimately really seal his fate and leave him kind of politically friendless and without influence after it passed. In Trump's case, business has always been mostly hostile to Trump. In all three of his elections, funds from business flowed massively into the Democrats because they were opposed to Trump. This then really reached its peak at the end of his first term in the aftermath of January 6th, when firms whose output represents about a quarter of American GDP announced a boycott of the Republican Party in response to January 6th. So there was like this effort to kind of discipline him. But what is so striking, particularly in comparison with McCarthy, is how quickly it all fell apart. So by March of 2021 already, the boycott is falling apart. Companies are issuing statements saying, well, we don't have a blanket boycott on election deniers, etc. And very quickly, they kind of resumed business as usual with the Republican Party under Joe Biden's presidency. So it's really a comparison that sets up the question of what has changed between these two eras when business was able to successfully discipline a right-wing demagogue in the 1950s and really failed to do so 70 years later.
We're going to get into the specifics of what business has done under Trump, how that's changed over time. But just to hear you explain that in the wake of January 6th, this enormous share of American capital is trying to mobilize against Trump and basically in the long term fails is a pretty sobering reality, and probably not one that a lot of socialists would even think of as like a possible. Like if that much of capital wanted something to happen, then we would assume that they would make it happen. And yet in this case, and in the case of these whole two presidencies, that is not what's happened with Trump.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the big arguments of my book is that the kind of relationship between capital and politics is often more complicated than we imagine on the left, right? We often, I think, operate with a kind of mental model from the Communist Manifesto of the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. But really, like whether the bourgeoisie agree amongst themselves, their ability to act in concert, all of that stuff varies quite a bit historically within a country and across countries as well. And I think that's really key to understanding what's happened to the Republican Party, is understanding some of those changes that have happened in the degree of capital's organization in the United States.
Now, what you're talking about is a kind of different emphasis than what a lot of the books in recent years on the trajectory of the right have focused on. There's been, for example, many books published in the last couple of years about the intellectual history of the GOP and the right, how the ideas of an increasingly radical right-wing thinkers have moved into the party mainstream, the open embrace of white supremacy, white nationalism, Christian nationalism, xenophobia, all of that. And your book is decidedly not about that. Those ideas make appearances throughout the book, but that's not fundamentally what your book is about. Why not focus on those ideas?
Part of the reason is, as you said, it's already quite well covered. There's a lot of discussion of the kind of intellectual and cultural history of the American right, much of it very, very interesting. But what I thought was really lacking was a look at the Republican Party as an institution. Like how does it operate as an institution, as a bureaucratic and organizational entity, and how is it related to other institutions in American life, like the leading organizations of business groups, like the Business Roundtable, like the Chamber of Commerce. And there, it seemed to me, there was a real hole in our understanding of the evolution of the right by not focusing on this kind of, the Republican Party can be thought of as the most important institution of the American right. And as a party, I thought it was not very well understood yet, because this emphasis on ideas doesn't really tell you what's happening with the party itself. Some of the most important figures in the party aren't necessarily important for their ideas. Like Newt Gingrich, for example, certainly fancied himself an intellectual, but if you look at his impact on the Republican Party, it's not intellectual, it's organizational.
Which is too bad, because he had some pretty fun ideas,
He did. He was like a futurist.
He wants to get into space more.
Exactly.
Get behind that kind
and he
of
writes
thing.
some great Civil War fiction.
Right. One of the key paradoxes of the situation in the Republican Party today seems to be that, as your book has in its subtitle, how Republicans went from the party of business to the party of chaos. There is indeed much chaos within the Republican Party. We see it on a daily basis. And you often see a kind of gleeful response from liberals and leftists witnessing that chaos, the kind of joy at watching this party that has wreaked so many horrors at home and abroad be racked by all of this internal fighting, because they assume this portends poorly for the party's fortunes in the future. But to state the obvious, that chaos has not sunk the GOP. The Republicans are running the show right now. So what are we to make of the fact that this party is so chaotic, yet remains in power?
Yeah, I think there's a couple aspects to that. The internal divisions in the party, I think, have been quite consequential over the last decade and a half, let's say. For example, the Tea Party insurgencies and various Senate campaigns absolutely did cost the Republican Party control of the Senate at times during the Obama administration, because they ran these absolute lunatics for various positions, despite what most of the party leadership and kind of party cadre wanted. So I think that the chaos has had costs at points. What I think is extraordinary since roughly 2018 or so is the degree to which Donald Trump's kind of authoritarian personality has been able to supersede so much of that chaos and keep it contained and at least kind of directed in a way that he wants. And that, I think, by making the party of Trump, he has, I think, kept it alive and strengthened it at various times. And for example, 2024, I think, Trump absolutely benefited in 2024, as he did in 2016, from his image as a successful businessman and all of that. And I think that really helped the Republican Party as a whole in 2024 in the elections. So I do think there are aspects of the chaos in the party that do weaken the party. But I think, particularly in the Trump era, they have been able to hold things together and to keep the chaos under control to an extent that has made the party much, much stronger. I think once Trump is off the scene, which one way or another he's going to be soon, I do think that we're going to see the chaos spill out in ways that are much, much more destructive for the party's electoral fortunes. And I think we might see a return to the kind of Tea Party dynamics of these people winning these primaries who just have absolutely no shot in a general election.
So the two main factors that your book covers in charting the breakdown of the Republican Party are the weakening of the party in the context of an already weak party system and the disorganization of American capital that you are already just speaking to. The weak parties may be familiar to many listeners, but the idea that capital is disorganized is probably a bit more surprising. But let's start with party weakness. Can you just describe the basics of U.S. parties and what exactly you mean when you say that they're weak? And maybe also like what's a counterexample from outside of the U.S. of what a party system that isn't weak looks like? What are stronger political parties elsewhere around the world capable of doing that U.S. parties are not?
Yeah, so probably the most concrete way to think about this is that in the United States, parties don't directly control who appears on their ballot line. And that's, of course, maybe the main function of political parties is to produce candidates to run for office. And so the fact that in the United States that process is done through this primary system means that, something like Zoran Mamdani's win, right, can happen, even though most of the Democratic Party officialdom in New York absolutely did not want that to happen. Similarly with Trump's victory in 2016, the Republican Party did not want Trump to win, but because of the institutional setup of American politics, they were really powerless to prevent it. So I think that's a fundamental dimension of party weakness in the United States is this. And if you compare it with like the Labour Party in the UK, the Labour Party as an institution decides who's going to run in what constituency, who's going to stand where, right? Like it's impossible for someone to run on the Labour Party ballot against the will of the Labour Party leadership. There's elections within the Labour Party for leadership, but once the leadership is in place, they ultimately control who runs where. The party gets to decide. In the United States, the party does not decide. And really it's mandated by state law in most of the United States that for state level positions, the parties have to hold primaries. And that means that the party as an institution doesn't get to control this most basic function of deciding who will represent it in an election. And so that's part of why parties are weaker. And it means that parties are vulnerable to insurgencies in a way that parties elsewhere in the world are just much, much less vulnerable. Parties can be kind of taken over and pulled away from their current leadership in a way that you don't really see in the same way in much of the rest of kind of the rich capitalist democratic world.
To continue with the Labour Party example, obviously you had Jeremy Corbyn standing for prime minister for the party, but after that bid failed, the new party leadership came in and essentially purged Corbyn and Corbynism from the party. That didn't happen, let's say, with Bernie Sanders. It's not like Bernie, after losing two different times in his run for president, had the Democratic Party is obviously quite hostile to what Bernie represents, but it's not like the party was able to like root him out and his supporters out of the Democratic Party. In fact, his movement seems to continue growing in many ways after his losses, and there's really not a whole lot that the Democratic Party leadership can do about that.
Yeah, exactly right. Even if they had wanted to completely purge Sanders supporters from the party, they had just no way to do it because they can't stop someone from running on their ballot line. And if that person, does a good enough job organizing, they can win. So that renders American parties kind of more gelatinous, I think you could say, than parties elsewhere. The borders are not hard. They're always vulnerable to people entering, mounting different kind of campaigns. And I think that's really key to what's happened in the Republican Party over the last few decades as well, is these insurgents coming up in the party, challenging the leadership, and the leadership just having no kind of organizational resources of the party itself in order to stop them.
Your book is about the Republican Party, but you're someone who's been on the left for a long time and has participated in these debates about what the left should be doing within the Democratic Party. Is it wise for us to be doing that or not? Those debates seem more settled at this point. The left has settled on this kind of insurgent strategy within the party that remains independent from the party and its leadership, but is mostly operating within the party at this point. And I wonder if this porousness that you're talking about that American political parties in general have is precisely why that is the strategy that makes sense in this moment. You've got a party that is incredibly porous and vulnerable to insurgent attacks, but you also have a party system where it is effectively a two-party system, and there are other avenues for running a left politics that has some kind of mass appeal and catches on in a mass way, feels largely blocked. And so that porousness is essential to what the left's current strategy is to try to win electoral seats and advance left politics in that way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think those two facts are deeply related. I mean, the primary system in the United States creates these weak parties, and at the same time, it creates a strong party system in which the two parties are extraordinarily secure in their places. It's, in the UK, the party system's kind of disintegrating right now. That's not happening at all in the United States, despite many predictions that something like that would come to pass. And the reason is simply that, one reason is simply that if you want to challenge the Democratic Party leadership, you have a choice. Do you do that kind of as a third party, or do you do that within the party? Which one looks like it's going to have more of a route to success? Well, as you say, over the last decade, the verdict is pretty clear that you can have a tremendous amount of success actually challenging the party from within. And insurgents in the Republican Party have faced the same choice and have come to a similar conclusion for, most of the last century, that if you want to pull the Republican Party farther right, the way to do it is to run in the Republican. If you want a new right-wing pole in American politics, the way to do it is to run in Republican Party primaries and try and pull that party farther right. The other part of the equation is that the United States has all kinds of laws that make it almost impossible to run as a third party. So, for example, restrictions on ballot access. And in the U.S., if you want to get on the ballot, in some places you have to collect signatures equal to like 5% of the electorate in a region, which in most other like democratic countries, those kind of laws are considered authoritarian and are like explicitly like banned by the EU, things like that. So you have these ballot access laws. And then the fact that elections in the United States are, privately financed means like if you want to raise money to run for office and you want to do that as a third party candidate, good luck, right? Like the resources that are available to someone running in a Democratic primary in terms of fundraising and all of that kind of stuff are absolutely massive. Just things like Act Blue, right? Access to fundraising platforms like that. So the kind of instruments that allow insurgent candidates to overcome the advantages of big money are themselves partially linked to running within Democratic Party primaries. So I do think that like the weakness of American parties and the corresponding strength of the American party system is a major influence on what has led the American left over the last decade to, as you say, largely choose the path of running insurgent campaigns in the Democratic Party.
Another element of this weak party system and the increasing weakness of both parties is actually the process of parties becoming ideologically coherent in the first place, which actually was not the case for the majority of American political history. That has to do with party realignment, which really takes off in the New Deal era. Can you talk about the development of ideological coherency within the Republican and Democratic parties and why that matters for understanding the Republican Party today?
Yeah, so for most of American history, American political parties have not really been these like cohesive organizations promoting a given kind of ideological worldview. Instead, they've been coalitions of kind of different regional elites who have come together kind of out of common interest and to try and find a common program, but have not been linked to like a more all-encompassing worldview of any sort. A great exception to this is, of course, the Republican Party of the Civil War era, which was united by this like ideological anti-slavery free labor vision. Though then after the end of Reconstruction, after the party kind of abandons Reconstruction, they move away from that and you get a return to these more non-ideological politics. And by like 1900 or so, a lot of observers are looking at American politics and being like, the parties just don't really believe in anything. So like Max Weber, the Prussian social scientist, is watching from across the Atlantic, and he's like, in the US, the parties are just gangs of office seekers. They're just rival gangs. It's not like they're united by like different interpretations of the Constitution, grand ideological visions, or anything like that. And this pattern really continues up to the New Deal. At the same time, parties were incredibly organizationally strong for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Like voting in the late 19th century was election day was something of a combination between like Mardi Gras and a gang fight, where the parties just organized these giant parades, to march people down to the polls. It was and participation rates are north of like 70, 80% in elections in these years. So the parties were organizationally extremely strong, even as they were ideologically indistinct. The New Deal begins a process of transformation of this when you get this kind of social democratic pole created in American politics. Now, at the same time, that was congenitally deformed because the Democrats, at the same time that they're the party of, social democracy in the United States, and socialists in Europe are looking at the New Deal being like, this is what we should do. Like, this is exactly what we want to do. So I use that term advisedly. The party is also the party of Jim Crow and the Jim Crow South. And so it becomes increasingly clear over the course of the 30s that the Democratic Party has become this kind of unstable amalgam of the most progressive people in the country, like these northern liberals, the most left-wing in mainstream politics at least, and the most reactionary, the Dixiecrats and the Jim Crow South. And so the next 30 years are within the Democratic Party an attempt to resolve that coalition or that contradiction, or in the case of some, to preserve it and to stabilize it. And that basically ends in the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which on the one hand, demolishes Jim Crow in the South, and on the other hand, kind of begins this process of realignment of Southern white voters. And so between the 30s and the 60s, the party is kind of in transit and there's a clear kind of tendency towards moving in a more consistent ideological direction, but that process is being fought out kind of year after year until the final victory of the civil rights movement. And there's a corresponding process happening in the Republican Party at this time too. There was a large branch of the Republican Party that was really quite liberal, in some ways going back to like Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose progressives, that whole wing of the party. So like Western Republicans in the 1910s, 1920s were often quite progressive. And going forward, you have people like Earl Warren, who was governor of California, and then on the Warren Court, he was a Republican governor. People like Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York, who were really these liberal Republicans who attached themselves to the New Deal in many ways, and institutions of the New Deal, often said, look, we don't want a big expansion of the New Deal, but we also don't want to roll it back. And from the 30s to the 60s, this is the fight going on in the Republican Party, basically between, are we the party of rolling back the New Deal, or are we the party of just stopping further growth? And in some ways, kind of Goldwater's victory in the 60s marks the victory of the rollback faction. Nixon is something of an interregnum there, but that faction really wins, and that victory is, of course, consolidated then when Reagan wins the presidency in the 80s.
As a kind of side note, on the left, sometimes the New Deal has been talked about in recent decades. It's like, of course, it had these progressive functions, but also it had this sort of racism baked into the core of it, which is true, but I think not in the way that many people think of when they say that. When you're pointing out that, of course, like this is a party that is not like the party, if we're talking about the Democratic Party, this is not the Democratic Party that we're thinking of today. It is a party that did have as one of its core constituencies these white supremacist Southerners. And so the New Deal project gets underway at a time when that is the reality of the party composition. And so it sort of is the lumbering into motion of a multi-decade process that involves eventually pushing that faction out of the party. But that's a sort of structural reality that FDR and the Democrats had to deal with at the time that the New Deal comes into existence. It's not in the sense that like FDR actively wanted to pursue this white supremacist vision through the New Deal. It's that these white supremacist Southerners were a part of the party that he had to deal with, and that had to be eventually, over the course of several decades, be pushed out. And as you said, it takes 3 decades or so in order to fully accomplish that. But eventually, that does come to fruition.
Yeah, and I think it's actually easy to underplay how much the New Deal got that ball rolling. I mean, in 1932, about 70% of Black Americans vote for Herbert Hoover. Why? Because he was a Republican. It's the party of Lincoln. It's who Black Americans, in the North, where Black Americans could vote, had voted for since the Civil War. In 1936, 2/3 of Black Americans vote for FDR. That's one of the biggest shifts in voting in American history. And it happens in 4 years, right? It happens extraordinarily quickly. Why? Because the New Deal did a huge amount for Black Americans, right? Like the various programs that were administered gave aid in Black neighborhoods, things like that. And Roy Wilkins, who would later be head of the NAACP, wrote a piece in the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, in I think the early 1940s, assessing the New Deal. And he said, look, the New Deal has had a lot of drawbacks, and various programs were administered in racially discriminatory ways. But he said the thing that's most significant about it is it's the first time the federal government treated African Americans as citizens, right? And he said that is not going to be forgotten. And I think today that part of it really often is how the New Deal was seen on the ground in terms of its racial politics is, I think, very often forgotten today, and how much it pushed that ball to get it rolling that eventually would complete its path in 65.
How does this establishment of coherency of the two parties play out once the process of realignment is sort of completed at the end of the 1960s? And what does that have to do with the party weakness that you write about so much in the book, that sort of really the 1970s are a key period for? What's going on in the 70s, and how does this new coherence interact with this party weakness?
So in both parties, there are people who political scientist Sam Rosenfeld calls the polarizers, the people who say, no, we want the parties to be coherent. This is the fight we're fighting. And that's happening in the party in both parties in different ways. In the Democrats, a huge battle is the battle against seniority in Congress, because these Southern Democrats preside over one-party dictatorships. And so they have the most seniority because they're never voted out of office, basically. And so the Northern liberals who want to pass civil rights legislation, they realize, like, if we want to pass this legislation, we have to get the Dixiecrats out of leadership. And to do that, we have to dethrone seniority. So this is a big battle in the 50s and 60s, is to get rid of the seniority principle. And it's replaced with a stronger congressional leadership. Now, like committee membership, all of that kind of stuff is based on what the congressional leadership decides, right? Like what the majority leader or the minority leader really wants. And on the one hand, you can say this is strengthening that party leadership, and that's how it was perceived at the time. But in the 1970s, this really interacts with this absolutely staggering rise in campaign costs as political campaigns really start to embrace like television and radio advertising as a primary means of campaigning. Before the 70s, the most important input in campaigns is labor. It's volunteers, it's party workers. That's who wins campaigns. In the 70s, it shifts to advertising. And that means a huge increase. Now, the most important input is money. And so this combines with this kind of more open approach to selecting party leadership to create a situation that really kind of consolidates by the 90s. Partially, Gingrich is the one who really pioneers this in making it so that whoever raises the most money is now the leader of the party, basically de facto. This is Nancy Pelosi's reign as head of House Democrats was really undergirded by her incredible success as a fundraiser. She just raised massive and redistributed throughout the party massive amounts of money. And so this effort to produce a more coherent party by dethroning seniority, getting rid of the Dixiecrats, this interacted with the kind of changed campaign finance environment to create a situation where now actually money just rules the day in the party. And actually the party as kind of an autonomous institution able to make decisions of its own has been diminished, right? Because now it's, well, whatever the funders decide is what's going to happen. Who they're giving money for is going to kind of be the leader. In the Republican Party, you get a very different but analogous development in that in the wake of Goldwater's defeat, there was a huge fight in the party and over which direction it would go. And part of the way this played out was over who would be the head of the RNC. And basically, they nominated a compromise candidate whose kind of outlook was, look, the job of the party is not to take a side in ideological disputes within the party. It's to just provide services to whoever the candidate would ultimately be. And this became known as the service model of politics. And this ends up as this nomination comes kind of as a result of a stalemate in the party. Goldwater's been defeated. There's all these Republican kind of liberals and moderates who want to get rid of Goldwater, but aren't quite strong enough to like push the right all the way out of the party. And so you get this service party conception, which again weakens the party. Now the party doesn't like decide questions of policy, of politics, anything like that. The party only provides services to candidates. And that then the Democrats actually start copying this from the Republican Party, and both parties really adopt this service party model, which is really the party model that continues to reign to this day, where like parties are kind of networks of like campaign service providers and channels through which money flow. And that's what the party as an institution really is. It's not making any kind of decisions about policy and politics.
Yeah, you have a subheading in one of your chapters called Parties as Bit Players, which is a sort of astonishing phrase to think about. I mean, the idea that parties themselves matter less and less at this moment is probably counterintuitive for many people. But this is in many ways a result of the flood of big money into politics, right? Like most people listening to this podcast understand the distorting effect of big money in politics at the most basic level, that big money and special interests can throw their money around at will to get their will enacted through legislation and enforcement or lack thereof, instead of what benefits the common good. And that's true, but also the story you're telling here is one in which essentially big money institutions like super PACs come to supplant the party itself, and then the party leaderships are increasingly those who can wrangle the most money, and those who are able to fundraise significant amounts are those who get leadership positions in the parties. And even disruptive candidates like Trump, who are able to raise large amounts of money, can essentially flip the bird to party elites. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the 2024 election is actually a perfect example of this. The 2024 election was the first time a major party's campaign has been primarily funded by super PACs rather than through the candidate committee that is registered with the FEC and associated with the party, all of that kind of stuff. Most of Trump's money didn't flow through his official candidate committee. It flowed through super PACs like Elon Musk's super PAC or various other groups. And so the party itself, most of the money isn't even going through the party, right? Now most of the money is going outside of the party as well. And so, on like questions about campaign strategy, things like that, the party increasingly doesn't have a major say over it. Elon Musk spends $250 million. He can decide what the main kind of PR, what the main advertising, the main geographic focus of the campaign is going to be. So yeah, I mean, I wrote that section before the election, but parties are even becoming even more of bit players.
So let's talk about the disorganization of big business. I mean, given the power of the American capitalist class as a whole, the record levels of economic inequality, the desiccation of the American welfare state, the attacks on the labor movement that have basically left it on life support, all the things that we know about the state of corporate power and working class weakness in the United States today, I always assumed that it was a given that capital would be able to organize and advocate on its own behalf. But this is actually, in your telling, not the case throughout post-war American history up to the present. In fact, there are only a few moments in that period, most notably in the 70s, in which capital does actually organize to defend and advocate for itself as a class. And you say that that has always been in response to worker organizing. So lay out this seemingly paradoxical situation of unprecedented corporate power and economic inequality with weak capitalist organizing.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it is that it is precisely because capital has been so dominant in American history that it hasn't needed to be as organized as capital elsewhere. So in the U.S., as listeners will know, movements of the left have generally been weaker. Unions have been weaker and smaller than elsewhere. The United States has never produced a electorally viable socialist party, unlike most of the rest of Western Europe. And so all of that has meant that capital in the U.S. has not faced the same scale of challenges as elsewhere. And because of that, capital hasn't really needed to organize on the same scale as elsewhere.
They've had it too easy.
They've had it too easy. Exactly. They haven't been disciplined. It's a little bit like a monopolist, right? In the market. Monopolists don't face the discipline of competition. And so they can afford to be wasteful in all of these ways and slothful. And American capital is much the same. They don't face the political competition of a highly organized and combative working class, outside of a few really specific moments. And so going back to the early 20th century, the weakness of American labor has meant that capital can get what it wants for the most part without really needing to be highly organized. They can defeat their workers. They can get the policy they want without these big kind of class-wide organizations organizing business as a class of the kind that you really see emerging in force in Western Europe after World War II, when you have, socialist parties or labor parties, at least on the verge of power in much of Western Europe. You have these labor movements that are much, much bigger than in the United States. In those countries, capital needed to figure out what are its class-wide demands for contesting with labor as a class, right? Not what individual businesses might want here or there, but how they can organize the class as a whole to make sure that they win what were really kind of some existential battles at the time. In the U.S., capital's really not faced those kind of stakes most of the time, and so the organization of capital has correspondingly been more sectional and partial, and business has often been more focused on kind of their narrow interests as individual firms or industries rather than as a class. They've been focused on what I can get for myself, not what we can all agree on that we need vis-a-vis labor.
In publishing in Jacobin, I'm often left feeling like a particularly vulgar Marxist most of the time, because it's just like the conclusion of many things is like, yeah, because we don't have an organized working class, like this is why XYZ bad thing is happening. And so when I got to this part of the book, I was like, oh, yet again, like because of the weakness of American organized labor, it's actually produced the weakness of the American capitalist class in a way, in its ability to mobilize and advocate for itself as an entire class. Like we actually can blame that weakness on the weakness of organized labor. Yet again, just chalk another thing up to the weakness of organized labor.
Yeah, that's if you wanted to boil the book down to the essence, it would be that American exceptionalism and a weak American working class is ultimately responsible for the insanity of the Republican Party today.
Right. What does this lack of capitalist organizing as a class mean for American capitalism in the longer term? I mean, surely this must have some negative effect for capitalist profit making, for the shape of the economy as a whole. I mean, if other countries have more coherent business class mobilization in defense of their interests, what are they getting for their capitalists that American capitalists are not getting because they're not mobilizing in that same way?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think about the post-World War II United States to understand this. So in the post-war United States, there were a number of prominent organizations of American business. There was the Committee for Economic Development, which I mentioned earlier. There was the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce. And essentially, the Committee for Economic Development was an organization of some of the CEOs of a lot of the biggest, most profitable corporations in the United States, the really big multinational companies that were emerging, or reaching new heights after World War II. And these were companies that thought, okay, the New Deal has been established. We don't want it to go farther, but we also don't think it's worth the fight of trying to roll it back. We think that could be chaotic, messy, and really could cost us more than it's worth. So we really don't want that. So they represented kind of moderate wing of capital. the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers were, interlinked with the John Birch Society in these years. And they were the ones who were like, no, the New Deal is communism. We need to roll it back. And in fact, Committee for Economic Development, you guys are probably communists too if you don't want to roll it back. And the Committee for Economic Development was very politically powerful in these years. So again, it's not that capital lacked influence. It's just that influence was not representing capital as a class, but it was mostly representing kind of the biggest firms, the most powerful firms, and what they wanted. And so in Europe, capital is organized, but their power is more constrained actually because they're contending with a very powerful labor movement, with very powerful, electoral socialist movements. And so they have to be organized to kind of tread water in some sense. In the United States, they're so completely dominant that they're able to get along quite well without any kind of class-wide perspective. And sometimes that means that some, small capitalists are more losers, right? So in the post-World War II era, when free trade is really in the ascendance in the United States and big capital loves free trade, well, a lot of small and medium-sized capital loses out from that. And that was a major force in the Goldwater campaign. The Goldwater campaign represented an eruption of protectionism from small and medium-sized businesses who were defecting from the free trade consensus. So in that sense, right, like the fact that there's not a class-wide perspective in capital means that like the less powerful bits of capital might get the shaft a little harder here than elsewhere because there's not a class-wide kind of movement trying to create a consensual political agenda. Instead, the big capitalists are often able to just set the agenda.
You say in the book that Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution was in many ways actually more important than the party's transformation under Ronald Reagan. And in fact, Gingrich waged a kind of war against Reagan. He insisted that Reagan was nowhere near conservative enough. Gingrich is a figure who often comes up in recent accounts of the party and its trajectory, but more often to recount how he helped bring about a more bellicose GOP, one that was rhetorically more reactionary and more openly obstructionist, and all of that is true, and you write about that a little in the book. But you also write that, quote, the late 1990s were a crucial moment during which the Republican Party broke violently with the preferences of most of big business in the waging of its long-running war against Bill Clinton. At this moment, the party was not merely becoming more conservative, rather, its pursuit of conservative partisan warfare against a president who had cannily built a massive corporate coalition behind his administration pointed towards a new relationship between the GOP and many of the boardrooms of corporate America. So central to this kind of transformation is the role of big money, and Newt Gingrich played a really key role in changing how big money affected politics within the Republican Party. Can you talk about what he rolled out in his position in the 90s?
Yeah. So as you said, kind of Gingrich comes into Congress. He's very ambitious. He wants to distinguish himself. And there's kind of two avenues for that for him. First, he launches this campaign against the Democrats of constantly accusing them of ethics violations and things like that, not directly really challenging them on policy so much, but this warfare of being like they're cheating, they're not doing things right, all of that kind of stuff. And his star rises with that. At the same time, he's really going after the Reagan administration quite a bit for not being right-wing enough, not being confrontational enough with the USSR, not cutting the welfare state enough. So really, from Gingrich's perspective, the whole problem with Reagan is that there never was a Reagan revolution, right? Gingrich would say there wasn't a revolution. We actually still need that revolution to happen. But the thing that's really decisive for him is that he grasps the new importance of money in politics in a way that almost no one else did. And so in the mid and late 80s, Gingrich builds this fundraising network inside of the GOP that is separate from the official party. He uses a PAC that he controls to do this that is basically about hooking up Republican politicians with potential funders all over the country. And so this apparatus becomes really central to the Republicans who are elected into Congress in like 88, 90, 92. all of them come to really depend on this redistribution of money that is all going through Gingrich and happening through his PAC in various ways. Some political scientists call it a shadow National Republican Congressional Committee. That's kind of the scale that it was operating at. And what Gingrich figured out is that if he can kind of be the man that the money flows through, then he can win leadership, right? And this is what propels him to leadership within the House Republicans. And really, Gingrich was very much an insurgent in this respect, in that, the Democrats had controlled the House for 50 years. So like Republicans in the House were used to being in the minority. They were not used to fighting hard, because what on earth was the point? And so Gingrich's ascent was really a contested one, very much, and it was powered by money the whole way. Then, when Gingrich wins the House majority in 94 in the Republican Revolution, he institutionalizes this fundraising model throughout the party. Now, all Republican House members are required to fundraise. They have quotas that they need to meet. And leadership of House committees, membership of House committees now comes with fundraising requirements. So by the end of the 90s, there's just posted prices for membership on various committees. If you want to get like a plum House committee assignment, you have to raise so many hundreds of thousands of dollars and redistribute them throughout the party. So Gingrich really restructures the entire House Republican Party around fundraising. It propels his leadership, totally transforms the party. It's very quickly copied by the Democrats, and then Republicans and Democrats in the Senate as well. And it really amounts to a profound transformation of how the party operated.
You describe the cycle within the Republican Party throughout recent history of a group of radicals with a kind of burn it all down reactionary attitude rising to prominence in the party, successfully waging war on the existing party elites, becoming the new party leaders themselves, only to then be subject to a new group of radicals who enter the scene and then start the cycle all over again. Obviously, Gingrich wasn't the first right-wing radical on the American political scene, but he was wildly successful in winning leadership position and really changing the party in many key ways. So can we credit him with kicking off these cycles of challenges to party leadership from the right that have produced the party of chaos that we have today?
Yeah, I think so. I think he is, more than anyone else, the kind of person who inaugurates this dynamic. And Gingrich is the representatives in the House that were really close to Gingrich. There's a reputation like the class of 94, right? The freshmen of 94, as they were called, are kind of known, that the people who come in on the back of the Gingrich Revolution are kind of known as being out of control in the House, right? There's a great book about them that goes into all the craziness and how many of them really turned on Gingrich himself quite quickly, and were willing to give him the shiv. So I do think Gingrich is the one who sets this agenda, this kind of pattern in motion. And I think that the whole kind of fundraising model that he puts in enables his own kind of displacement, right? Because it means, okay, well, now Gingrich is the Speaker of the House. Well, if you can raise money, you can challenge Newt Gingrich, right? And that's, in some ways, that's what Tom DeLay does. Now, Tom DeLay eventually works with Gingrich, but he was not one of Gingrich's guys. He was not who Gingrich wanted. He rises in the House by being a great fundraiser and kind of forces Gingrich to accept him as part of his leadership team.
You have a very interesting section in the book on the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Before we get to that, from Gingrich assuming his leadership role in the House up to the impeachment, how would you characterize what Gingrich had achieved in the party with relation to big money and the need for this kind of fundraising, but also the party's relationship to capital as a class that we were talking about before?
Yeah. So I think Gingrich accomplished quite a bit in that regard. I think he, just in winning the House, he made it so that business was now free to donate way more money to Republicans. When Democrats always had the House, business needed to donate, a good amount to Democrats because they're going to be the incumbents and they're who you want access to. Now that Republicans rule the roost, the money can really start flowing to Republicans in just a huge way. And Gingrich's agenda in the House was one that had a huge amount of support from business. Things like welfare reform, which low-wage employers across the country absolutely loved because it basically pushed a lot of poor women into the labor market who welfare had allowed to kind of stay out of it to various degrees. That was loved by business. The war against Bill Clinton's healthcare reform, which is not really remembered that much today, but was really much more radical than Obamacare, actually. The war against that, business really supported very, very strongly, and Gingrich was an important leader of that. And in fact, even Gingrich's government shutdowns to try and force budget cuts and austerity in 1995 and early 96, even that business was supporting, even as, government shutdowns can be quite chaotic and costly for business. But if you read like the Chamber of Commerce's magazine during and after the shutdowns, they're like, the Republicans fought a great fight on this. It's really important that they took this stand, even if they lost. So business was really behind the Gingrich agenda. Now, the fact that Gingrich loses the government shutdown fight and Clinton wins, that tarnishes his star quite a bit. And his reputation in the country as a whole really goes down as he's kind of tarred as a someone who wants to slash the social safety net and throw old people and children to the wolves. And so Gingrich is hurt by that. And at the same time, Clinton, in going into 1996 and his second term, moves quite sharply to the right and embraces a whole host of policies that are extraordinarily friendly to business, from telecommunications reform, which loosens kind of ownership regulations and is why we have things like Fox News today, to really wholehearted support for free trade and globalization. So Clinton is actually able, even as Gingrich has done quite a bit that business loves, he's lost this really central fight. And at the same time, Clinton is moving to the right and winning huge support from business in doing so. And so the fight over Clinton in his second term and impeachment happens at a time when actually business was really happy with the Clinton administration and saw the Clinton administration as a really reliable friend of their agenda. Clinton in his second term is talking about privatizing Social Security, which is a huge giveaway to the financial services industry because now they would manage all of these counts and, charge fees for them, etc. So, business loved Bill Clinton in his second term. And that's why I think they looked with really some trepidation at the Republican effort to impeach him, right? Like, impeachment had kind of started for Richard Nixon. Andrew Johnson had been impeached. The effort to impeach Bill Clinton did not seem on the same scale, and business was really not convinced that it was worth it. And if you read the business press at the time, they talk about how, look, this is going to crowd out other things we want. We're not going to be able to get our agenda passed. This is going to kind of slow everything down, muck everything up. And that's exactly what happened, right? When Clinton starts to be impeached, his support for Social Security privatization disappears because he needs the liberal Democrats to defend him, and he knows they're not going to be on board for that in the slightest. So the business was absolutely right about the effect of impeachment on their agenda.
This is the source of the meme that floats around on the left sometimes, that Monica Lewinsky saved the country from Social Security privatization.
Exactly.
I mean, you make an argument in your section on impeachment that I've never heard before, but that fits perfectly into your larger thesis about capital as a class's inability to get its will carried out in politics, but individual industries or even sometimes individual corporations within the capitalist class being able to push their agenda and get it through. And in the case of impeachment, you make this case about the tobacco industry's centrality to the impeachment process. So explain the case. What did big tobacco have to do with Clinton's impeachment?
Tobacco prior to the 1990s was a bipartisan industry that donated to both Democrats and Republicans. There are plenty of Southern Democrats who represented tobacco districts, was not a super political industry. And at the same time, it's important to remember it was a massive industry with some of the biggest companies in the country were the tobacco industry, or the tobacco companies. So it was really, really a huge, huge industry in the 90s. What Clinton did to piss them off was he allowed the FDA to classify nicotine as a drug that needed regulation under the auspices of the FDA. Prior to that, nicotine was not regulated as a drug. And the Clinton's Surgeon General, who actually had been appointed by George H.W. Bush, and Clinton had just kept him, really made this push and showed Clinton all of these papers and kind of all of this research demonstrating what the tobacco industries knew about the addictiveness of nicotine and their efforts to market it to children, things like that. And when Clinton read this stuff, he said, I wanted to kill them, right? I just wanted to kill the tobacco companies. And after he gave the FDA the go-ahead to classify nicotine as an addictive chemical, they wanted to kill him too. And if you look at donations from the tobacco industry after 1994, suddenly they're like nothing is going to Democrats and everything is going to Republicans. There's this massive shift. So in Bill Clinton's second term, if the question is like who in the business community was really unhappy with Bill Clinton's performance, the answer is tobacco, the tobacco industry. Then if you actually look a little more closely at the impeachment proceedings, suddenly you see tobacco's footprint and fingerprints absolutely everywhere. So Ken Starr, who was the special counsel who investigated Clinton, he is working representing tobacco companies as an attorney at the same time that he is special counsel. He's actively representing tobacco companies in lawsuits. A number of the other attorneys who worked investigating the Monica Lewinsky affair, etc., were also actively representing tobacco clients at the time. The person who pushed it in the House most strenuously was Tom DeLay, representative from Texas. Tom DeLay was one of the biggest recipients of tobacco money in Congress at the time. And perhaps most importantly, the decision to appoint Ken Starr was taken by judges who were appointed to a panel by senators from North Carolina. And there's a lunch with the senators from the Republican senators from North Carolina the day before this kind of crucial panel to appoint the independent counsel is convenes, in which it sure seems like they're basically saying we want to appoint someone who's going to go get Clinton. So you see the tobacco industry just absolutely everywhere in the impeachment proceedings. They're funding the people who are really going after Clinton, and they're also the part of American capital that in the late 90s at least had the most reason to want to see Clinton removed from office.
I hear what you're saying about tobacco being one of the largest industries in the U.S., but it's not like tobacco was like Wall Street. Like it's not like tobacco is at the heart of the functioning of the entire American financial system. I mean, if you are like a Wall Streeter who's very happy with what Bill Clinton is doing for you and the rest of the finance industry, you must have been tearing your hair out to watch this sort of like, rump, like declining capitalist industry sort of setting on fire the good thing that you had going for your industry and for so much of the rest of the capitalist class. You're just like, why is this happening and why are we not able to stop this from happening?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the sentiment from them. And yeah, like I said, in the business press, some of them are like, well, this really sucks for us. And this circus is totally a distraction from the important work we want to get done, like privatizing Social Security and making sure we have free trade with China. But since the 1970s, the kind of ability of capital to act as a class and produce this kind of class-wide understanding and class-wide action in defense of their interests had really gone down. And so you have this situation where you have a lot of firms that have a kind of diffuse interest in impeachment not happening. And then you have this group of firms that have a very intense, concentrated interest in impeachment happening. And when you don't have kind of well-developed institutions that build collective action, that concentrated, intense interest will beat the diffuse kind of widespread interest every time.
Yeah, I mean, it's an example of what can happen when you take on an industry like tobacco and, not liquidate it, but really severely hurt it. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of what are other industries that would be, top of the line for us to similarly try to liquidate today, like the fossil fuel industry.
or crypto,
or any of these, especially in the context of this weak system in which capital can't act as a class. I mean, you're essentially vulnerable to any kind of industry that is angered at the attacks on it and is able to wield a significant amount of damage to whoever has done the damage to the industry. And I mean, this doesn't seem sustainable. I mean, you can just do this ad infinitum across the political system, across the economy. This truly is chaotic stuff here.
Yeah, and there's unfortunately a long history in the United States of kind of individual firms or individual industries being able to really shape American politics in decisive ways, going back to the way that the silver mines took over the Populist Party in the 1890s and reduced this kind of economic radical populist program to nothing but free silver coinage, which would of course be a huge boon to the silver miners. It's dispiriting just how dominant capital has often been in American history and how that's allowed even small pieces of it to exert their agenda in massive ways.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, publishers of the book Ladder or Lottery by Gary A. Hoover. Is our economy a ladder or a lottery? Are people able to control their position on the economic spectrum by their actions? The argument is, if you play by certain rules and make certain choices, you'll achieve upward mobility no matter what economic position you were born into. In Ladder or Lottery, author Gary Hoover explores what this social contract requires of its citizens, what it offers in return, and what the reality of it actually is. Learn more about Ladder or Lottery at UCPress.edu.
You make an argument about our first Republican president of the 21st century that is not heard often on this podcast, and that is George W. Bush. Underrated, at least as a party builder. And, you make the case that we think of W as this sort of bumbling guy whose puppet masters like Dick Cheney are really the ones who are pulling the strings. But actually, you make the case that he's underrated as a party builder. He's underrated in terms of what he was able to accomplish within the Republican Party, at least at the beginning of his administration, and how he is able to sort of keep to bring some of these forces, the Gingrichian type forces, into the coalition with him, while also not letting the yahoos fully take over, and also to reach a kind of a real modus vivendi with capital in a way that felt like was, certainly in the period that we were just talking about during Bill Clinton was not happening within the Republican Party. So lay out that case for George W. Bush, the effective Republican Party builder.
So to appreciate this, I think it's helpful to think about what was all going on with the Republican Party in the 90s. So on the one hand, you have the real failure of Gingrichism. I mean, Gingrich ends up being quite bad for the Republican Party. Bob Dole adopts much of Gingrich's agenda in 96 and loses. And after the debacle of impeachment, the Republican Party, had this image of kind of fanatical, priggish, and not very oriented on what most Americans thought were the most important problems. And George W. Bush comes to be seen as an alternative to all of this. His slogan, compassionate conservatism, that he runs on, was crafted to signify that this is not Newt Gingrich's Republican Party anymore. He had been a successful governor of Texas, really working often in a very bipartisan manner with Democrats. He had really spurned the xenophobia that was surfacing in the Republican Party at the time. And actually, when he's reelected in Texas, I think in 98, he wins a majority of Latino votes in Texas. And so a lot of Republican Party leaders are looking at this and being like, this guy can be the future of the party, right? Like, he's allowing us to rebrand, and he can win with Latinos after this rise in Republican xenophobia had really driven them away. At the same time, however, Bush is an evangelical Christian who speaks the language of the Republican right, who's very, very comfortable talking with them about abortion, things like that. And so Bush manages to achieve this kind of unity between two wings of the party, his father's kind of corporate moderate wing and the Gingrich wing that had really been at war for much of the 1990s. He's able to bring them together in a way that seems successful and durable. And, during his first term, people like Karl Rove were talking about a permanent Republican majority under the Bush model, right? That we're going to get 30 years of Republican dominance with George W. Bush's politics as the foundation of it. So I do think that Bush manages to create this unity in the party. And then after 9/11, the kind of project of American imperialism cements that even further because both wings of the party were in complete agreement on the need to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So I do think Bush really does achieve something impressive in the early 2000s in hammering out this kind of peace accord in the party. And at the same time, what he's doing is really bringing business back to the Republicans, despite the kind of alienation of the late 90s, with an agenda of tax cuts, deregulations, attacks on workplace organization, etc. And assembles this just absolutely massive corporate coalition behind him in 2000 and 2004. And the Democrats that are really reduced to kind of begging for scraps from groups like trial lawyers, right, who are kind of the only source of big money for Democrats in much of this period.
And he and the party are effectively acting more like the coherers of the capitalist class as a class throughout, at least through the first term and into the second term, I think, too. But there's not that kind of dynamic of allowing sort of rogue sections of the capitalist class to dominate things in the way that you're arguing the tobacco industry did during the Clinton impeachment. They're playing that more kind of grown-up role of acting as referee for the capitalist class as a whole.
Yeah, and there's two dynamics, or two places where you really see this dynamic. The first is Bush's big tax cut. He had campaigned on a massive tax cut. There was a government surplus, a budget surplus at the time, and Bush's line was we should have a huge tax cut. And at the start of his administration, he gathers all of these CEOs in a room and says, you guys actually aren't getting anything from this tax cut. All of it is going to personal tax cuts. None of it is going to corporate tax cuts. And he says, this will kind of produce a base of popular support for me, and then I'll be able to take care of your agenda. And they say, okay, sounds good. Right? He coheres them around this. And it's exactly what he does. The Bush tax cuts are these massive cuts to personal income taxes, and they're followed up over the next few years by a series of cuts to corporate taxes that take care of the corporations. And the second area where you really see this is in the invasion of Iraq, which has often been talked about as done at the behest of the oil companies. They're the ones who really pushed the administration into it. But when you really look into the decision-making process, you see something very similar. It's true that they gather all the oil companies together and say, okay, here's our kind of our line of march. What do you guys need from that, right? They want to solicit the interests and the support of the oil companies. But at the same time, the policy is very clearly not being made by the oil companies. And you see this because if you look in kind of the broader foreign policy think tank world at the time, you see really a kind of consensus on the need to invade Iraq, the need to remove Saddam Hussein. So it seems very unlikely that the Bush administration was simply taking orders from the oil companies when there's a much broader consensus at the time, even among the liberal sections of the kind of foreign policy think tanks on the need to remove Saddam Hussein. Instead, there was certainly they solicited the advice and the needs of the oil companies, but they were not acting at their behest.
So why was Bush able to bring the party back to this more traditional form of Republican politics?
I think part of it is just that Gingrichism and delayism, if you want to talk about that, had really crashed and burned by the end of the 1990s. Like I said, the impeachment process was just a massive failure for the Republicans. I mean, their gains in the 1998 midterms, right in the thick of impeachment, were minimal. And actually, the person, Gingrich, ends up getting forced out of office over ethics concerns. And the person who was going to replace him ends up having to resign because Hustler magazine exposed that he had affairs as well. So like the Republican Party is kind of weakened by this. And so on one level, I think that had really discredited much of the Republican right. And at the same time, the Republican right was never very good at producing presidential candidates. They never produced kind of presidential candidates who'd been in the top tier in the Republican primaries. And so Bush is able to kind of move forward with that. But I do think the fact that he was a genuine evangelical, really connected to the evangelical churches, that allowed him to bring that section of the party with him. And then, like I said, I do think that September 11th and the subsequent imperial reaction also played a big role in Bush's success in holding the party together during his first term. And it's when that project begins to unravel, really in 2005, 2006, that you see that party, that unity start to splinter.
So Bush has this success over the course of 2 terms that then in the second term starts to disintegrate, especially as the U.S. is losing the war in Iraq. But then the financial crisis comes along of 2007, 2008, and the combination of those 2 things in particular seems to have discredited the Republican Party significantly. You also have this generational political talent in Barack Obama getting elected in 2008. But from the perspective of the GOP, that brings us into the era of the Tea Party. So talk about the sort of the revival of chaos in the GOP during these years.
Yeah, so the first step of that is the debate over immigration reform in the Republican Party. George W. Bush wants to push a very kind of pro-corporate expansion of guest worker programs combined with like some kind of path to citizenship for undocumented people living in the United States. And this sets off just a furious reaction from the Republican right, who absolutely refuse any kind of accommodation on immigration reform and just want a totally draconian enforcement-only agenda. And the party really kind of splits over this, and Bush is ultimately unable to pass immigration reform. So that, he had come to power in the Republican Party as the kind of antidote to Republican xenophobia, but he proves unable to subdue it. And in fact, I think there's a strong case that September 11th and the kind of militarization of immigration and securitization of immigration as an issue played a role in the revival of Republican xenophobia. If you look at like the House Immigration Reform Caucus that Tom Tancredo, the real kind of chieftain of anti-immigrant politics in the party at this time, he starts this caucus in the late 90s. And before September 11th, I think it has like 12 members. And then like 2 years later, it has like 60. So I think in some ways Bush's success in kind of militarism and that kind of thing undermined his agenda with immigration. But so you see a big split in the party at that point, and that split becomes even wider when the financial crisis hits. And when the financial crisis hits and when it really explodes in the fall of 2008 and the bailout is needed, that's when all of a sudden Republicans are voting down George W. Bush's bank bailout. In the wake of them voting that down, the stock market crashes, just massive stock market crash. There's a huge push from corporate America to push the bailout, to get it passed. George W. Bush personally calls every member of the Texas delegation to the House and asks them to vote for the bill, and none of them change their votes as a result. It's kind of the ultimate illustration of a lame duck president. And so eventually they're able to pass the bill. It kind of limps across the finish line, mostly relying on Democratic votes. A majority of Republicans still vote against it. And this is a sign that really that kind of corporate consensus republicanism that Bush had achieved in his first term is dead, right? Like now you have a majority of the Republican Party voting to kind of tank Wall Street in the most savage way in the moment of greatest crisis.
So this is the moment when the Koch brothers really step in with huge amounts of money that they are willing to spend against the kind of George W. Bush style conservatism and stoke anger at the bailout and aid to homeowners in 2008. This is a key moment. I mean, they've been involved in politics for many years by this point, but that's the time when the Kochs really step in and help fund a Tea Party that I've heard you argue before, of course, has this element of astroturfing in the sense of there's Koch brothers money behind it. So there's big money from the right that is kind of astroturfing. But there is also a genuine grassroots character to what was going on as well. And so they're able to capitalize on that and really bring the Tea Party into existence right near the beginning of Obama's presidency.
Yeah. So the Koch brothers had been involved really in like libertarian party politics and think tanks prior to this moment. In the 2000s, during the George W. Bush presidency, they had kind of started to play footsie with the Republican Party, started to get involved with some kind of Republican funding. And really in the immediate aftermath of 2008, they emerge as the locus of this network of funders, various kind of billionaires and sectors of the ultra rich who are all pushing for a much more combative Republican politics that will not compromise with the Democrats, that will go back to kind of Gingrich burn it all down style politics. And they established themselves very quickly on like the scale of the Chamber of Commerce and the National Republican Congressional Committee in terms of fundraising. They're raising just absolutely huge amounts of money. And of course, they're enabled in all of this by the Citizens United and Speech Now decisions by the Supreme Court that established super PACs, so that now all of this money can kind of remain under their control rather than just being like given to the party, which may or may not do what they want with it. And this becomes the foundation for this insurgency within the Republican Party. So 2010 sees a record number of primary challenges in the Republican Party as all of these Tea Party candidates are challenging, Republicans in the House and Senate, often backed up by, aspects of the Koch network. And at the same time that this is happening, establishment Republicans are responding with a super PAC network of their own, anchored by Karl Rove and his group, American Crossroads, which seeks to kind of raise huge amounts of money and spend it on behalf of continuing the George W. Bush Republican agenda. And so from 2010 up until 2016, the Republican Party is basically consumed by a civil war between these two groups, as kind of the Tea Party wing and the Karl Rove wing are both contending. What's kind of extraordinary about it is that both of them are operating mainly through these super PACs that are institutionally separate from the party itself. So the battle over the future of the party is largely happening outside of the party rather than within it.
So we talked earlier about how Gingrich helps set off these cycles of radicals entering the party and declaring war on the party leadership and displacing them, and then the cycle repeating itself over and over. And obviously that was a really central element to what was going on in the Republican Party during these years. And I lived through this, so I remember it. But in reading your book, I'd forgotten about like all of the battles over who the House Speaker was, and these incredible insurgent challenges from the right that were shocking to so many people. But like both this incredible amount of money that was behind these right-wing challenges, but also the genuine grassroots right-wing energy really remade the landscape of the Republican Party during these years, and seemingly helps set the table for what comes after the Obama years in the form of Trump.
Yeah, so during these years, John Boehner is the leader of the House Republicans, for example. He was a Gingrich guy, right? He was one of like Gingrich's insurgents in the 1990s. Now he's the establishment, and he's like the piñata for all of the Tea Party insurgents who are, just see him as the ultimate sellout, kind of do-nothing Republican who doesn't really want to fight the Democrats. And so they're pushing for these like government shutdowns, these fiscal cliff fights. They're contesting his speaker nomination when the Republicans win back the House, all of this kind of stuff. This moment is really when that first generation of insurgents now find themselves really out positioned to the right by this new generation who see them as the new establishment that needs to be taken down. And the way that this plays out is not just kind of, in the politics of the House itself. It's in all of these primaries that in many cases lead to Republican candidates winning the primary who have no hope of winning the general. And the Tea Party probably cost the Republicans control of the Senate for at least early in the Obama administration because they're nominating people like Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, who's the woman who runs a campaign ad that starts off explaining why she's not a witch.
I'm not a witch, I'm you.
Yeah,
I'll never forget that ad.
Great one. It's a great one.
In hindsight, how do you look back at how the Democratic Party was understanding what was going on during this period? It just seems so clear that there was no willingness to engage with what was clearly a qualitative new reality of the right-wing politics that they were up against. And rather than try to do something new to effectively counter it, they essentially doubled down on old strategies. You could say that, of course, remains the strategy of the Democratic Party today. But your book is about the GOP, but like, how were the Democrats understanding this as this was happening at the time?
Yeah, I think one thing you could say has changed in the Democratic Party from today and then is that then people like Obama really believed that they could find ground for cooperation with the Republican Party and that the Republicans could be brought around in some sense. I mean, I always think of Obama going to the House Republican retreat in like 2009, I think, maybe early 2010, when like the House Republicans have their retreat to talk strategy. And Obama goes and addresses them and then spends an hour taking unscripted questions from them. And if you watch it, you can watch it on YouTube. It's incredible because he's so smooth and so good. And they're taking swings at him and they just got nothing. They don't land a single blow on him, right? It's like watching Muhammad Ali. Like they just don't land a single hit. It's one of the most impressive things I've ever seen a politician do. Like personally impressive, but politically it represented this belief that like if he went and talked to them and made a reasonable case and showed them how, like part of what he says is like, look, you're voting down all these bills. If you can work with me on this stuff, I'll give stuff for your districts in these bills. We can give you things, like we can find ground for compromise. We can work together. And none of them go for it, right? None of them go for it. So, for example, Obama's stimulus bill, which they pack full of tax cuts, a third of the bill is tax cuts, which, most economists at the time were like, this is really not a very efficient way to spend this money in terms of the amount of economic stimulus you'll get from it. But he loads it with tax cuts in order to get Republican votes. He doesn't get a single Republican vote for it, right? Similarly with Obamacare, there's all these kind of compromises that are made in the hopes that you can get some Republican support for it. It's based on Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts. It's very far from Medicare for all. Republicans don't vote for it, right? So I think the Democrats couldn't see what was happening in Republican politics. And the fact that like there was just no chance of winning any Republican support for anything Obama was going to do. And I do think the Democratic Party has at least learned that today, that, Hakeem Jeffries may not be a very good leader, but I don't think he expects to get Republican support for anything Democrats do when they're in a majority.
Thinking about the bailout in the wake of the financial crisis, Obama's stimulus, these are measures that were taken that were really essential to the functioning of American capitalism and its place in the global financial system. And the right-wing response to it kind of proves the central thesis of your book, right? That these measures being taken on behalf of the capitalist class as a whole get this absolutely vitriolic response from the Tea Party and from their elected representatives in Congress, that this is not something that they are going to stand for, despite how essential it is for the functioning of American capitalism.
Yeah, and here you really start to see the split in business as well. So like the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, the big organizations of business, they're all completely behind the stimulus bill. They're like, this is really needed. We really need to pass this. The Koch network is totally against it. And so that's part of what's happening in the Republican Party is again, this kind of splintering of business. But if you look at like the rest of Obama's agenda, you also see something kind of similar. So Obamacare, for example, is supported by, again, the Business Roundtable. The Chamber of Commerce really opposes it. And in order to understand that, you have to understand some of the transformation of the Chamber of Commerce over the previous decades. So in the 90s, the Chamber of Commerce really adopts a new business model where instead of trying to find kind of consensus among their members, instead of trying to like produce this agenda that all of the companies could get behind, they start just renting out their services to various companies, where the companies might risk kind of a PR hit if they themselves were lobbying for a given bill or a given position. But the Chamber of Commerce itself would do that for them and kind of provide some kind of reputational cover for them. And that's basically what happens under Obamacare is the Chamber of Commerce goes to war against the policy, and it comes out that they've just gotten massive donations from some of the health insurance companies that opposed Obamacare to carry this out. They weren't in any sense representing a kind of consensus position among American business. The Business Roundtable was something much similar. What happens then with the Obama's kind of financial reform with the Dodd-Frank bill is Wall Street is totally against this bill. And this brings the Republicans a little bit back closer to more of a mainstream business position. In kind of their campaign against Dodd-Frank, they're able to kind of reunite with some of the sectors of big business that they had really alienated along the bailout in particular. So the kind of Republican war on Obama's policy agenda reflects some of the splits among business and some of the way that manifests in the Republican Party, but also is an opportunity for the Republicans to kind of rebuild some bridges at various points.
In hindsight, especially given everything that we've talked about so far, the 2012 presidential campaign and the party's decision to run Mitt Romney as its presidential candidate looks absurdly idiotic. I mean, just clearly a candidate from a bygone era of Republican politics that was not going to be up to the challenge of dealing with like where so much of the base of the party was at, and he was a candidate of capital in a party that was no longer acting at the behest of capital as a class, basically.
Yeah. And that, Romney's nomination reflects part of what I alluded to earlier, in that the right of the GOP was never very good at producing presidential candidates. And in 2012, they didn't really have a strong candidate. There wasn't like a good Tea Party candidate for the presidency in 2012. So you get Romney, who had massive support from business. And in the general election, business just goes massively for Romney, right? Like they really don't support Obama in big numbers at all, except for some firms, some industries like tech really stay with Obama. But on the whole, the business class goes for Romney. They lose partially because Obama had built such an incredible fundraising machine that was able to harness all these kind of small donors in 2012. And so Romney's support from business doesn't translate into electoral victory. At the same time, his defeat, I think, really opens the floodgates for the Republican right, in that it's a really decisive discrediting of the Republican establishment. They had really expected to win that election. Paul Ryan famously had to explain to his crying children that they weren't going to be moving to Washington, D.C. after all. Like the Republicans really thought they had 2012 in the bag. And when they lose it, it's kind of the Republican establishment's last stand.
So given everything that we've talked about, now that we've arrived to 2016, I mean, Trump and his victory in 2016 don't seem quite so odd anymore. I mean, it seems like the culmination of everything that we've been discussing thus far. How does Donald Trump relate to this kind of factional warfare within the party and capitalize on much of it?
So Trump comes in as a creature of neither side. right? He's not a Tea Party guy at all. In fact, right, he's famously against cutting Social Security and Medicare. He runs as really an economic moderate who's not going to be a budget cutter. At the same time, he's very much not one of the establishment. He runs on this like insane xenophobia and anti-immigrant politics that the establishment, particularly after 2012, had really been trying to jettison, right? They saw that xenophobia as a weakness for the Republican Party and saw we have to go back to George W. Bush and kind of trying to be more pro-Latino. So he kind of wrongfoots both sides because he's not from either of them. And at the same time, it turns out that like the audience among the Republican primary electorate for this combination of kind of economic moderation combined with really intense culture war politics was quite large. There was a large audience for that sort of politics. And because the Republicans had been locked in kind of trench warfare within the party, the kind of party's electoral base was not really listening to the cues that were coming from elite Republicans anymore because the party had been so divided. There wasn't kind of any kind of consensus within the party anymore. So when Trump comes in, he's able to sidestep this battle, and both sides kind of thought Trump would be to their advantage. Jeb Bush is like, well, Trump is going to split the kind of far right vote and make it so like Ted Cruz, who was kind of the strongest of the kind of extremist candidates, he's going to split the vote with Ted Cruz. And that's going to be great for me. That's going to make it easier for me to win the primary. Ted Cruz says Trump is going to rile up all these voters and make, you know, these kind of culture war issues more salient in this election. But ultimately, those voters will come to me because I'm the person who can present those most effectively. I can do it better than Trump. So actually, it's good for me that Trump is in the race. So both camps also were like, we don't really want to spend that much time attacking Trump because we think his presence in the race will be to our advantage. So that's what enables Trump to win. Without the kind of division of the party in the 2010s and the factional warfare that had developed, I don't think there would have been an opportunity for Trump to come in and win in the same way that he's ultimately able to. So I think Trump is very much a creature of the divisions in the party, even as he's not associated with either side of them.
Yeah, can you talk about your thesis about a weak Republican Party and a lack of real organizing by capital and how they play out during his candidacy and then his 2 terms as president?
Yeah, so Trump has the ability to finance his own campaign in the primaries. And so even though basically all of business is against Trump in the primaries, he's able to raise so much money just from himself that it doesn't hurt him that much. And then once he wins, business really deserts the Republican Party. A lot of like traditional Republican funders, some of the party's biggest donors, just refuse to open their wallets to Trump. And by August of 2016, Trump is having to lay off campaign staff. Like his campaign is on the verge of disintegrating. And he's finally able then to convince a couple key Republican billionaires like the Mercers, very rich finance family from Long Island, to fund his campaign in a major way. And they are able to kind of allow his campaign to limp through the rest of the fall. But basically, everybody is operating with the assumption that Trump is going to lose in 2016. It's going to be a disaster, and then the party will move on. That's the operating assumption of everyone. Trump's campaign team is telling him, "Look, you're going to lose this election." And as a result, in 2016 in November, Trump doesn't have a victory speech written on election day. He has to like write one on the spot. He had actually been trying to fuel up the plane to go to Monte Carlo with Melania, after they lost, and he had conceived of his race as what he called the greatest infomercial in the history of the world. He's like, this will just be a great opportunity to present, my brand and to do something next after The Apprentice, basically.
Which is kind of still proven to be true. He just also won the presidency.
Yeah, exactly. So he wins the presidency, which is a real surprise. And this leads to this kind of situation where the Republican establishment is now coming in and saying, okay, we have to work with him. Maybe we can contain him. And for most of his first term, they're able to kind of contain Trump in various ways. I mean, just the turnover of staff in his first administration is extraordinary, as all these people just keep resigning, and it leads to, bureaucratic paralysis, and they're just not able to get that much done. The things they are able to get done are basically traditional Republican policy, proposals like tax cuts, a more aggressive foreign policy towards Russia, right? Like if you just look at kind of the policy outputs of Trump's first term, in a lot of ways, it looks like a generic Republican first term, but that's because he was constrained in all of these ways. What is happening at the same time as that, though, is that Trump is steadily remaking the party, and the people that oppose him, that don't stand with him, are getting pushed out. And that process just continues over the next 8 years, really, up until today. And by 2024, he has taken over the party so completely that there's really no opposition in any organized fashion left. There's an attempt, right, to mount the DeSantis and Nikki Haley primary campaigns in 2024, but once those lose and lose quite badly, there's nothing left.
It's almost like Trump understood the weakness of the party and its infrastructure and its leadership and all the things that we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation, and just sort of intuitively sensed that he could force his will upon it, that there actually wasn't a kind of grown-up in the room who was ever going to step in, that there was no reason why he could not fully impose his will on the party, and he just had the chutzpah to do it, and he obviously successfully achieved that.
Yeah, and I think he's aided by his kind of media presence and his kind of status as like this charismatic figure in various media environments, and the image of him as this successful businessman and all of that kind of stuff. I think contributes to this cult of Trump in the party that results in a situation where, like, by 2020, the party doesn't even write a platform, right, in the election. They just say whatever Trump says, that's what we believe. And in 2024, when Trump says you got to drop the pro-life plank from the platform, the Republicans drop it, right? Something that had been like unimaginable in the Bush years, right? That the Republican Party would like drop a plank on abortion. But Trump says it and it goes by 2024.
What did big business do in 2020? It seems like capital really went in many ways into the Democratic Party, having just seen the nightmare of Trump's first term and knowing that he was not going to be an effective advocate for what they wanted done. They went to the Democrats. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's just a massive move to the Democratic Party in 2020, from finance to, whatever sector you want to look at, basically. Trump had very little support from business. And that is repeated in 2024. Trump has very, very little support from business in 2024. The Democrats out fundraised the Republicans in 2016, in 2020, and in 2024. The thing that's really different in 2024 is that Trump is able to count on financing from a couple extremely ideological far-right billionaires. Elon Musk, the Uline family, a handful of others donate just an incredible amount of money. Elon Musk donates $250 million. And so basically Trump's business support in 2024 has shrank considerably. It's narrowed quite a bit compared to like someone like George W. Bush, who had very, very broad business support, but it's very, very deep. These people are willing to spend on a level that's basically unprecedented in American politics. And that allows Trump to have enough of a campaign operation in order to win in 2024, combined, of course, with the weaknesses of the Biden administration and the Harris campaign.
What's the explanation for the tech tycoons who are standing behind him in the 2025 inauguration in light of everything we've been talking about? Why is he able to win over this segment of capital, some of the most important contemporary capitalists in America? What explains their capitulation to his agenda?
I think there's a couple things. First, there was always a sector of tech capital that was far right that bought into various kinds of ideologies about the end of democracy and the rise of philosopher kings and all this kind of nonsense, right? There was always a sector of tech that was invested in those kind of politics, and they moved to Trump very quickly. There was also, I think it's worth remembering, this wave of kind of labor activism and workplace activism more broadly in tech in the early 2020s and late 2010s that I think led a lot of tech executives to say, like, we got to get these guys under control, right? Like this kind of
Mark Andreessen, he's always talking about this, right? He's shocked that his employees were making demands on him.
Exactly. And I think that led a number of people to kind of embrace Trump and this kind of new reactionary politics as well. And then the third tendency there is people like Mark Zuckerberg, who were really not terribly ideological, and really actually had been Democrats for much of the preceding decade. But once Trump wins in 2024, I think a huge sector of tech capital and capital more broadly says, okay, the way to negotiate this is to cut individual deals with Trump, not to try and oppose him or organize opposition to him or anything like that. Instead, we're going to cut individual deals. And they realize, like, actually, if you just like flatter Trump and give him something shiny, he's willing to do huge favors for your company. And so we've seen that again and again. They all line up to kiss the ring, to fund the inauguration, to go in and talk about what a great president and a great leader Donald Trump is. And in return, they get various forms of clientelist handouts from the White House that are, more or less openly corrupt quid pro quos. And I think that this has served to further disorganize capital because now it's every man for himself with Trump, right? It's like every firm goes and is trying to cut their own deal with Donald Trump rather than organizing any kind of like common agenda. So with like the tariffs, for example, rather than like companies mounting like a really strong, like this is a terrible agenda, you need to roll this back, this is hurting us. Instead, they're all trying to cut individual deals, get their products exempted in various ways. Oh, no. Like, actually, the tariffs aren't appropriate for my product, Mr. President. I think the tariffs are fantastic in general. They're a great idea. But just for my product, they don't really work. So can we please have an exemption? And by the way, here's this donation, and here's, a gold square that can sit on your desk or something like that, right? Like, that's been what's happening in business. So if you look at, like, the Supreme Court case with the tariffs, it's all companies you've never heard of because they're the ones that, like, don't have the juice to get an individual deal with Trump. So for them, this kind of opposition, like forthright opposition to the policy is the only avenue left to them. Interestingly, since the tariffs have been overturned, you have seen more of the really big companies in the U.S. starting to launch like lawsuits to recover their lost tariff revenue. So I do think like now that policy has kind of lost, you are seeing more business opposition to it emerge.
I wonder what you think about the fact that on my read, Trump seems completely uninterested at this point in fulfilling many of his core campaign promises, whether it's bringing prices down for consumers or not going to war in Iran. He's so underwater on all of these issues. There's increasing talk of many of his supporters feeling betrayed by what he's doing. There's a rise of prominent figures on the right who are increasingly willing to say that Trump is betraying many of the core promises that they thought were at the heart of MAGA. What explains all of this? Is it just because he truly doesn't care about what happens to the Republican Party after he's gone? Is he just, happy to listen to whoever is in his ear at the last moment and decides to go that way and isn't even thinking about fulfillment of campaign promises? I mean, why is he acting with such disregard for the popular things that he did run on that delivered the 2024 presidency for him?
Marxists like to talk about the relative autonomy of the state and the idea that like there's a certain distance between the state and capital. It's not a one-to-one relationship. And I think Trump is a great study in this concept in that when you have someone who has attained as much power as he has, where he has this party that's totally subordinate to him that runs all the branches of government, like his individual psychology does actually start to be more important in explaining things. And I think fundamentally what Trump loves is getting to be the decider and the deal maker. right? That's what he loves. That's the most important kind of image of himself. And so something like the tariffs set him up to do that. He's like, I'm going to do this tariff war against the entire world, and then everyone's got to come beg me for favors, and I get to decide who the winner and who the loser is. I mean, he kind of wants the presidency to be The Apprentice, right? Like where people have to come and kind of compete for his favor. And I think there's something kind of similar with Iran. I think like Netanyahu and the Israelis said, you just did such a great job with Venezuela. You can do the same thing with Iran. And then you get to pick who the new leadership will be, and they'll be totally dependent on you. Won't that be great? Right. So I do think that element of his psychology is important to understanding why he doesn't care about, electability, affordability, kind of any of these things. I think, like the people around him, like Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, whose job it is to say like, well, is this going to be good for the midterms? I think they have a very difficult job, frankly. So, yeah, I think that understanding Trump's psychology is important. And I'm very resistant, accordingly, to some of the strain of thought you see on the left that says, well, actually, Trump is really being rational about all of this. And actually, there's like a real logic to all of this. And if he might be evil, but he's not stupid. I just think that with everything we've seen over the past year and a half or so, it's very hard to reconcile that argument with reality. Like this war was clearly launched with no plan whatsoever, is a total disaster in every way, and is probably going to end with Trump basically pulling out in defeat in one sense or another. He won't call it that. He won't talk in those terms, but that is looking like the most likely end at this point. So I do think that like attempts to kind of sane wash Trump, as some have called it, are deeply unconvincing in this moment.
And what do you think about the movement on the right, where people like Tucker Carlson, for example, are increasingly dissenting on some key parts of what Trump is doing? Some people seem to be trying to set themselves up for future leadership fights within the party. I mean, it seems unlikely that we're going to see a replication of Trumpism without Trump. Like Trump really is a once-in-a-generation figure. But there is going to be somebody who emerges as the leader of the party after Trump. And it seems like we're starting to see people try to like stake out different lanes in that future fight right now. So what is your read on how these things are beginning to play out, and how these figures like Carlson and others are staking out a sort of Trumpist approach, but with some key distinctions, and in some ways trying to be on paper in terms of their policy agenda, like more Trump than Trump himself, or sort of trying to stay true to what they consider to be the real heart of MAGA?
Yeah, I think one lesson of the first Trump administration is Trump is the only one who gets out alive. Everyone else's career gets destroyed by it, right? Like if you just go through the first Trump administration and look at who served in it, they're all out to pasture now, right? Like none of them are really political players anymore, with the exception of someone like Stephen Miller, who's kind of a lamprey attached to the shark. So, and I think we're likely to see something similar play out with this administration, that the people in the administration, I kind of think are political goners. I think like Vance and Rubio, as kind of the two most likely to try and inherit. They're the Donald and Eric in the cabinet. And I think that they are just going to be so attached to all of the disasters of the administration that it's going to be really, really hard for them, just as it would be really hard for anyone attached to the George W. Bush administration to succeed him in 2008. So I think we're going to see some real Republican knife fighting over the next few years as people try and position themselves. I wouldn't be at all surprised if someone like Thomas Massie makes like a halfway credible run for the nomination in 2028. I doubt he'll win, but I think he could easily be one of the top three. And if you told someone in 2020 that Thomas Massie might be a top three Republican candidate, they'd look at you like you're insane. But I think like someone like him or Carlson, et cetera. And I really think that like whoever it is, kind of who rises to the top will be who can distance themselves most effectively from the administration and from the disasters that it's creating. I think that's going to be an increasing trend. And I think particularly after the midterms this year, we're going to see Trump's hold on the party really start to splinter and look a lot more fragile than it has.
I buy all of what you're saying. I guess I would just go back to what I mentioned earlier to say that this doesn't necessarily make me feel better or more confident about what the political future has to hold, given that your book is all about these cycles of these kinds of intra-party knife fights. And I'm sure at the time that they were happening, as I mentioned before, people on the left or liberals were sort of excited to see this kind of fighting take place, and they think that it portends doom for the Republican Party. But then actually this new generation of even more reactionary right-wingers steps into leadership positions, and they occasionally win elections, especially if all of this is taking place up against a Democratic Party that is running someone like a Gavin Newsom as their figurehead. I mean, we could see all this ugly infighting within the Republican Party, and we could see real slugfests about where the party should go. But like, if they're up against someone who in the Democratic Party who is a kind of upholder of the status quo, there's no guarantee that the Republican Party will not continue to dominate politics in this country.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that like the diminished capacities of the Republican Party for forging consensus between its different constituent elements are going to make things harder for them electorally in the near term, at least. I do think that that's going to be difficult for them. At the same time, yeah, if it is a race between Gavin Newsom and Tucker Carlson in 2028, I think that's a real nightmare for the left, for the country, and for human civilization, basically. But I think you're right that like we are going to see an increasing radicalization of the Republican Party. I think like open anti-Semitism is going to become much more common in the Republican Party. And I think, a total discarding of adherence to elements of kind of American civic religion around like morality, multiculturalism, etc., are likely to grow even more intense in the party over the coming years. And we're going to see some stuff that might have been unimaginable in the Bush years, for example, for prominent Republican politicians to embrace. I don't see any end to this cycle of radicalization in the party, just an increasingly kind of chaotic and turbulent manifestation of it in the near term.
Paul Heideman, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
That was guest host and Jacobin editor Micah Uetricht interviewing Paul Heideman, the author of Rogue Elephant: How Republicans Went from the Party of Business to the Party of Chaos, out now from Verso Books. Heideman holds a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University, Newark, and is a frequent contributor to Jacobin. He works as a history teacher in New York City. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, France therefore seems to have escaped the despotism of a class, only to fall back under the despotism of an individual, and, what is more, under the authority of an individual without authority. The struggle seems to be settled in such a way that all classes, equally powerless and equally mute, fall on their knees before the rifle butt. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theo Rio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio, and do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever else that I can't recall, please do rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling friends, colleagues, family, strangers to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.